Welcome once again to the Foreign Policy Week in Review with Daniel McAdams. Thanks for joining me again, Daniel.
Hi, Jay. Thanks for having me back.
Always good to talk to you about the latest weekly events on the world scene. And this week, I would say, it seems to me one of the big news items, if not the biggest, was what might be termed Minsk II. And that involved peace talks, supposedly, hopefully, peace talks on the Ukraine. Talk to us about that.
Sure. Well, the meeting, just to back up just a little bit, actually, what started the whole thing, I think, and we talked about this last week, I believe, Jay, is that all of a sudden the U.S. media started reporting how there were new calls in the U.S. to arm the government in Kiev, which, as you know, that's the U.S.-backed government that the U.S. helped them overthrow the previously elected government. So all of a sudden, the New York Times is reporting there's a big push to arm Kiev, and I think what happened is I think the prospect the real prospect of a major European war finally spooked German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President François Hollande, and they decided to hightail it to Kiev and Moscow to see if they could find some kind of solution, I think, to forestall the U.S. push to escalate the situation. And so these sort of semi-emergency meetings, I think, took place, and very interestingly, I think, without the presence of the United States. The U.S. was not involved, and they culminated toward the end of this past week in a signed deal. The leaders of the four countries, Russia, Ukraine, France, and Germany, they had what appeared to be like a 17-hour marathon session of negotiations, and they came up with a 13-point plan to implement another ceasefire. That's what we call it Minsk II, because the talks took place in Minsk, Belarus, and it was the second agreement to come out of talks held in that city. So this is where we are. There's a 13-point plan. The ceasefire is supposed to start on Saturday between the two sides, but to make a long story short on that, all sides essentially agree that this is not going to be any kind of mid or long-term solution. There are just too many things that are left unresolved. But I think the most interesting thing to consider about this is that Europe is seemingly finally awakened to the real dangers of this very aggressive U.S. Policy in the region, and have decided to try to take something upon themselves to fix the problem.
Well, if Merkel and Hollande went to talk to Putin and not the United States, does that assume the United States isn't a player in this game?
No, I think the U.S. is definitely a player, and I think they're definitely involved behind the scenes. You know, I think Merkel went out a couple of times to probably make a couple phone calls and try to explain what was happening to Barack. You know, who knows? But the U.S. is definitely involved, but they're not visibly involved. You know, they're not the center. Obama likes to say how the U.S. is the indispensable nation. When there's ever a problem in the world, they call the U.S. Well, this is one time that the problem is being solved, or appears at least to be addressed, without the direct participation of the U.S. So the implication is, I think, that people in Europe can sort these problems out themselves. This is a 6,000-mile away problem from the U.S., and perhaps if we just, pull our noses out of it even further, they'd find some way to resolve this issue.
Oh, God forbid that we wouldn't be important to stick our nose into that issue.
Exactly.
How could that be? We have to be. We are the great United States of America, the indispensable superpower, and of course we have to fix everything. So it seems, I read at least in the Financial Times that there were that both the British and the U.S. some people's noses were out of joint over not being a party to this conversation. But we keep hearing, Daniel, all the time, of course, that it's that Putin is the cause of the problem. I was just picking up the New York Times here. It said that essentially it was saying, but in Minsk, this is a part of an article titled "In Ukraine, It's Putin's Game," and this was from the New York Times of February 12th. But in Minsk, they confronted the reality that Mr. Putin retains the upper hand precisely because he is prepared to use military force to get what he wants in diplomacy. End of quote. So they're saying that Putin is still in charge, and the reason that he has the upper hand is because he is willing to use military force, unlike us, of course.
That's an interesting point. You know, it's always the same. He's strong, but he's weak. He's on his knees, but he's in control. I don't think the U.S. media knows what quite to say about it. But we always hear it's Barack Obama who says all options are on the table. Is he not willing to use military force? You ask the Syrians who are having their airspace violated daily whether Obama is willing to use military force.
Right. Oh, yeah.
But, I wrote something this week about the Minsk agreement, Jay, that I think something that I noticed. I think is fairly interesting. And this, I think, was in the original one, but it's reiterated in the second Minsk agreement. And this is point 10 of the 13 points that they agreed on. It says all foreign troops, heavy weapons, and mercenaries are to be withdrawn from Ukraine. And you know, this was crafted, I'm sure, with the idea that these 10,000 or so Russians that the Western side claims are active in Ukraine. You know, Russian soldiers. If you remember, Poroshenko, the president of Ukraine, the U.S.-backed president, says there are 9,000, then there are 1,500 more came over, never providing any proof. But so this was certainly drafted with that in mind, that these Russian army soldiers would have to go home, or Russia would be punished with more sanctions, etc. But what is not said, but certainly just a basic reading of that point would be, well, what about U.S. troops? What about U.S. Special Forces, U.S. CIA personnel who are said to be on the ground there? And even more importantly, what about 600 U.S. paratroopers that the president is sending to Ukraine next month to train the Ukrainian military? Are these not foreign troops? And if so, ironically, isn't it the U.S. which would be violating the ceasefire agreement by sending troops over to a place where they're forbidden to be?
Yeah, but I mean, you don't hear it put that way in our media, do you?
No, you don't. And the other thing that I pointed out in the piece is that, the U.S. and Kiev says that there are these 10,000 Russian troops there. Russia says no, provide proof. The U.S. has not provided any visual proof, although they have the satellite capacity to do so. But this will sort of, in a way, this is sort of truth or dare. It'll show who's lying, because if there are 10,000 Russian troops and they all have to leave when this agreement is implemented, then we'll definitely be able to see 10,000 troops in a line marching out of Ukraine. So that'll show that Russia is lying. If there are no troops in Ukraine, if there is no big ex-migration of troops from Ukraine back to Russia, then it'll suggest one of two things. Either Russia is breaking the agreement, or there never were Russian troops, Russian regular army troops in Ukraine to begin with. Mm-hmm. So either way, we'll get some resolution, at least theoretically. But it's funny, Jay, here's one of the big things that happened today. Senator Inhofe, who's a very, very militaristic neocon U.S. senator, well, he was handed some photos from a visiting delegation of Ukrainian members of parliament, and this was the big proof of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And Inhofe, he's the great expert. He's pushing Obama to get more militarily involved, and so he leaked these photos to the Daily Beacon, or the Free Beacon, which is the big neocon paper in Washington. They published them. Finally, we have the pictures of the lines of Russian tanks entering Ukraine. Except anybody with an internet who knows a little bit about the region very quickly found out that these are not at all in Ukraine. They're actually taken in Georgia in 2008.
Wow.
So here they thought they had the smoking gun, and Senator Inhofe embarrasses himself. His bellicosity is undermined by his incompetence when it comes to this. And he said, well, it doesn't matter anyway. The facts are still the same, even if these photos are not real,
Yeah, that's incredible. He wants to have it both ways, and So he was embarrassed. So you think there's people? I mean, there are still are some people that are opposed to war in this country, aren't there, Daniel? A few of us.
There are a few who are opposed. It's not enough to be opposed to war, though, Jay. And this is where we get into some trouble. You have to oppose war propaganda,
Right.
because it's easy for people, the Johnny-come-latelys, to say, "Hey, I was against the Iraq War,"
Right.
But it's really the people who are against the war propaganda who are demonized. And you remember from people like Ron Paul and even Dennis Kucinich and others at the time of the Iraq War, oh, this is Saddam's best friend, and they've said the same thing about Russia,
Right.
Ron Paul is Putin's best buddy and all this, which is totally absurd. It's just
Of course it is.
It's just as likely that he's Putin's best buddy than he was Saddam Hussein's best buddy or any foreign leader's best buddy.
Right. Right.
But there are again and again, attack after attack that he's, that anyone who's opposed to this war propaganda must be in the pay of a foreign power. It can't simply be that war propaganda in many ways is more dangerous than war itself.
Mm-hmm.
Because of how it sucks people in, it sucks well-meaning people in.
Mm-hmm.
Look at the U.S. involvement in Syria and Iraq against ISIS. Remember, this started out as a and I guess I'm getting ahead of us, but this started out as a limited operation to rescue this religious minority on a mountaintop.
Right.
And now where are we? Where are we? Here's our topic 2. I'll let you introduce it, Jay. But where are we this week?
Well, we're digging ourselves deeper and deeper, as always, into military, into the lives of other people, and making people angrier and angrier at us all the time. And Daniel, I really worry that ultimately, we had 9/11 because we were over there, and now we're having beheadings of people that are friendly to the United States, or people that maybe not friendly to the United States but oppose ISIS. And there's no doubt that they're angry as hell because we're doing awful things to them. So the more we do these things, it seems to me that we become less and less safe and more prone towards violence here. But no, I think that Obama, though, seems to be, or at least some people, maybe more the Republican neocons or neocons in general, who are really pushing Obama, wanting to give him a blank check. It seems to me, if I understand this right, maybe you can talk about it, because I believe Ron Paul addressed it on the website, the whole notion of Obama having, I guess, a blank check to go to war anytime, anywhere he pleases.
Yeah, it's really incredible. He sent a letter to Congress, or he sent a proposal to Congress, a proposed authorization for the use of military force, which is unfortunately what passes these days as a declaration of war.
Yeah.
But this requested authorization would allow President Obama to use the U.S. military, and I guess his successor, to use the United States military anywhere in the world for the next 3 years. So really is a declaration of worldwide war for the next 3 years. And of course, as we always see with legislative language, what appears to be restrictions on it are actually even further liberalization of the authorization. And my colleague Adam pointed out this week in a short piece that he did for the site that if you look at the language, what appears to be a restriction is actually the opposite. As I've just said, it says that the president, he is not authorized to use U.S. armed forces in enduring offensive ground combat operations. That sounds like a mouthful, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But let's take it apart. Mm-hmm. Enduring, what does that mean? That you ask 5 people, they may say something different.
Right.
Is it a week, a month, a year?
Right.
14 years like Afghanistan? What does enduring mean?
Uh-huh.
Offensive, what does that mean? What is the difference between defensive and offensive operations? The whole thing in Iraq and Syria now is considered defensive.
Yes.
Although the U.S. is invading a country that has no possibility of threatening the U.S.
Right.
And what are ground combat operations? That's hard to know either. That we already have 3,000 ground troops in Iraq, yet the president claims that we have no boots on the ground.
Yeah.
So every single word in that limitation is completely deceptive. Typical of how Congress completely turns the English language on its ear.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the demagoguery is just, it's horrendous. It sort of reminds me of the time when Richard Nixon promised us back in 1971 when he took us off the gold standard that it would be temporary. And
Yes.
here it is, 2015, we're still with the same thing, but I guess the same kind of rhetoric and misperception is plaguing us all over the place. And I mean, at first blush, when you listen to that, it sounds like, oh my goodness, this is pretty good. We have a president here that really is a peacekeeper. I mean, he really is trying to be careful about the use of power. But you know,
And you see the president's requested military budget for the coming year. It's the U.S. Once again, the U.S. military will be more expensive than the next 10 nations' militaries all combined.
Yeah.
So imagine having the largest budget by a landslide in the whole world, and then having the president also have a blank check to use the military anywhere he wants. Mm-hmm. How many hundreds of billions of dollars more will that cost?
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Daniel, just one thought I had, getting back to this Minsk agreement and the need for troops to be, Russian troops alleged to have been in Ukraine, to be removed. Isn't it possible that that we will just simply look at pro-Russian separatists that might be Ukrainian people, that they have to get out?
That could be the case, but you know, the other thing is the government in Kiev doesn't necessarily want to have a mass exodus. That's a big PR problem too. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So one of the points in this 13-point program is that the government in Kiev will restore its control over the entire border between Ukraine and Russia. Mm-hmm. And a lot of separatists who probably would fear retaliation should Kiev take back over, they would like to probably go to Russia, where many of them have family and they have cultural and linguistic ties. It actually, ironically, will be them kept in by a new Berlin Wall that's being built between Ukraine and Russia.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
as we know here, the walls that they say are built to keep the foreigners out are often to keep us in.
Right. Well, that's it's tragic. It really is. It's way too bad that whatever it is, you know, I mean, it seems to me that the notion that there can be any peaceful settlement here, I believe that the IMF is providing some funding now for the Ukrainian government, and
I think there's a promise of $17 billion, which is a drop in the bucket for what they need. I think I forget the exact number, so don't quote me, but yeah. I think something like 12 billion of that has to go to their current creditors just to service some of their debt. So this is basically not a bailout for Ukraine, but it's a bailout, as we see in Greece. It's a bailout for people who put their money into, you know, buying bonds and these things.
Well, let's just say it's a bailout for the bankers once again.
Exactly.
Which is
and ironically, it's a bailout to Russia because Russia is legally due quite a bit of this money. They are owed quite a bit of money. So
yeah, interesting. Very interesting. Well, we can hope and pray for peace, but you know, it's very difficult to be hopeful. You know, I guess we can hope that maybe the Europeans, who have certainly more skin in the game when it comes to conflict with Russia than we have, that they will stand tall and stand firm against the neocons who, in my way of thinking, have one objective in mind, and that is to control as many countries around the world and take their sovereignty away from as many as they can, and get our corporate interest embedded into these countries as much as possible. And to me, that's the bottom line. Are we fighting for liberty and freedom? Hardly. When, at least if we are, it's the dumbest war you've ever fought.
Yes,
the
exactly.
dumbest foreign policy ever engaged in the history of human beings, because all we do is create less. Not only do we destroy lives, kill people, but take their freedom, their liberty away from them. People's heads getting chopped off, and every which horrible thing is happening these days. The more we get embedded. Anything else, Daniel, you'd like to mention this week? I think you had some comments on Yemen, perhaps, that might be worth just passing along to our listeners.
Sure. I had one final thought on what you just said, though, Jay, which is something I know that Ron Paul always says, and I'm sure you feel the same way. He talks about commerce and peaceful trade relations as being the real great peacemakers.
Absolutely.
And, you know, the Spanish released some information this past week that the EU's sanctions on Russia has cost the EU 21 billion euros, which is a pretty good chunk of money. So I think there is some pressure being exerted on the political leaders, who are, of course, always interested in making war, by the business leaders, who are interested in commerce, which promotes peace. So that might be something to be optimistic about. If the people that are pro-commerce and pro-trade get the upper hand, that's how you'd find peace breaking out.
No question about it. And there's some really big deals too that have been hurt. Big programs that were going to go forward. One, I know there was some natural gas program between a French concern and Russia that was put on the back burner if it's going to happen at all. But I'm sure there's lobbying in France for for dealing, but for going forward on those projects and for peace.
Yeah.
But when you think about it, Daniel, it makes so much sense. In my little neighborhood here in Queens, New York, the people that I do business with in small ways, the guy at the corner store, the real estate friend of mine down the street, and so on and so forth. You develop good relationships with people that you have commercial dealings with. It's usually the way it is. I mean, because one is providing a service that you need, and you're thankful for that, and life can prosper and be built up, and lots of good things can happen. But when you try to steal from other people instead of earn your living by providing a useful service, and you try to use force to take over their country and to get your way, then terrible things happen. So I guess that's what empires do. And is there anybody that's going to say that the United States, that we don't have an Anglo-American empire post World War II? I don't think anybody doubts that. So we're an empire, and what empire throughout history hasn't done horrifically bad things to people, Daniel? I don't know of any.
Yeah, absolutely, and horrifically stupid things to its own people.
Well,
Destroyed
exactly.
the economy.
Right. But talk a little bit about Yemen. You wrote something about Yemen. You titled it Yemen Today, Another Fall of Saigon Moment for the U.S.
Yeah, exactly. And it was, I guess it's slightly funny, but not that awfully funny. It was only back in September that President Obama cited the U.S. anti-terrorism strategy in Yemen as really the benchmark of a successful strategy. This was the best example of the U.S. Anti-terrorism strategy. Well, this past week, the U.S. has had to abandon its embassy in Yemen because it was overtaken by Houthi rebels. This is a Shia group which was opposed to the government that had very, very strenuously backed the U.S. use of drones against its own civilians, under the guise of killing Al-Qaeda. So these guys took over the country, and the unrest got so severe that the U.S. had to, just as in Saigon, had to hightail it out. And according to press reports, I think CNN and Reuters, it got to the point where the U.S. had to abandon all of these fancy vehicles they had at the embassy, and the Houthi rebels just took all these wonderful cars and APCs and all these things that the U.S. had. And even the U.S. Marines, as they left, had to hand their weapons to these Houthi rebels. So
oh my goodness! Leave.
So I mean, imagine that imagery of the Marines handing over their weapons to these guys. I'm sure the military-industrial complex loves that because it's a few more gun sales. But talk about a dramatic departure. It's funny, you don't see this in the press. You certainly won't see it as reported as a failure of interventionism. That everywhere, if you remember, it was just a few months ago, the U.S. had to do the same thing in Libya. They had to turn tail and run after this wonderful liberation of Libya. They almost had to do the same thing in Iraq. And as a matter of fact, as we speak here, Jay, late on Friday, al-Baghdadi, a town in Iraq where there are 300 U.S. military trainers, is now under siege by ISIS.
Oh.
So things are heating up there, but everywhere that the U.S. intervention is supposed to produce peace and prosperity and democracy, it's produced nothing but chaos, war, and destruction. So here's the U.S. turn tail and run from Yemen. And the neocons will never say, well, gosh, I guess we were wrong about invading these places. No, they'll say, well, it was just because we didn't drop 10,000 bombs instead of 5,000.
Right, right. It's the same argument that, and I mentioned this last week, the same argument I hear all the time about monetary policy in the United States. it didn't work very well in the 1930s because we didn't do enough of it fast enough, hard enough. And so Bernanke this time was going to do it fast enough, hard enough, and it's not working again. But never do they question the premise upon which their policies were based in the first place. And Daniel, I think it's just a crime. It's a shame that here, we'll never hear this narrative here in the United States from the mainstream about why the Houthis gained control, why they were angry at their government.
Yeah,
They were angry at their government because there were drones that were going over being used to incinerate, to kill on the spot, not even necessarily the targets, and then their friends of targets sometimes get blown away.
sure.
And we talked last week about incineration.
Yes,
And that,
exactly.
in fact, drones result in incineration. The United States is has the biggest incineration game going, perhaps.
It's really terrible, and as you know, the rules of engagement are such that any military-aged man who's anywhere near a drone strike is considered a legitimate target,
Right.
even if they're not rebels.
Right.
So that means the civilian deaths are grossly underreported.
Yeah. Well, of course, and it's too bad. I mean, all we can do, Daniel, is keep. I just want to thank you again for explaining this stuff to us, because it's people are very, very busy. It's difficult, and I think what you provide is this some of these details about what's really going on in foreign policy that otherwise we'd be completely ignorant about. So I just want to thank you again for taking your time to pass this on. Anything else you'd like to talk about today, or I guess those are the big ones, probably the big topics of the week.
Those are the big ones. Keep your eye on the chaos.
I wish, Daniel, I wish there wouldn't be a need for the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity, but there is.
Exactly. Yes.
And so people need to keep that in mind too. If you value what Daniel is doing and what the other scholars are doing there under the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity, please find a way to give a few dollars to this very worthy organization, in my view. It seems sometimes the odds are overwhelmingly against us, but we have to keep. I think we have to keep speaking the truth, Daniel, and ultimately, somehow, I do also believe that the laws of economics come into play, and ultimately, we can hope for a turn. At least we have to hope and work towards it. So thanks again, Daniel, for being with us this week.
Thanks very much for having me, Jay.